We are now recording.
Welcome everybody to the latest edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. I cannot believe it's 2015, and it's absolutely amazing to think where the years are actually flashing by. 2015, it sounds like we already should be living in some kind of science fiction movie. Particularly when you get to my age, when I was sort of growing up in the 1960s, the idea of being here and now is just an amazing thought. But instead of actually going into deeper space and going out there into the outside space, what we're doing these days is we're delving deeper into the space that's inside ourselves. And I think our whole science is changing to look inwardly, to think that there's an inner space as much as there is an outer space. And this is one of the reasons I'm delighted to have back for the very first time a guest that we've already interviewed in the past, my good friend Graham Nicholls. The reason I'm keen to actually have another conversation with Graham is that I'm very, very excited about his recent trip over to California and all the other exciting things he's been doing. Now, again, this is completely off the cuff and everything else, because Graham has not told me a great deal about the adventures and the people he was interviewing. So my gasps of surprise and everything else will be quite genuine, because it's the first time I've had the opportunity to talk to him. So this will be one of our sort of more relaxed fireside chats, because Graham and I have met on many occasions now, and I consider Graham to be an excellent friend. Graham was the person that convinced me that my initial position that consciousness was located and rooted in the brain. It was Graham that convinced me of otherwise, with some very, very powerful evidence, which I genuinely believe now that there is a very strong case for the idea that consciousness is some form of field that surrounds us in one way or another. Now, without greater ado, I'd like to introduce Graham into you guys. Now, those of you who have not known of Graham's work before, I'll give Graham a little bit of an opportunity to just describe a little bit about himself for about 2 or 3 minutes, just so that he can introduce himself to everybody else. So over to you, Graham.
Okay, well, I guess my main area is the out-of-body experience, although I do look at wider areas of consciousness and ideas of psychic ability and things like that. But essentially, I started having experiences when I was very young, mainly out-of-body experiences from around the age of 12. And then I started to explore all of those different areas, learn to induce the experience for myself, develop technology later on, including immersive structures, virtual reality, all different sorts of technological devices that help with inducing the out-of-body experience. More recently, I've been quite focused on science and actually trying to look at the veridical side of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and related phenomena, and trying to support that whole endeavour to understand more about it and to take the whole area forward. So I guess that's what led to my US trip and meeting with Dean Radin and some of the other people that I met out there.
Well, if you can now take the opportunity to tell us a little bit, because I mean, I'm interested as to how the whole thing came about, where you did, who you met, and everything else. So please take us through it, because I know that you met with some fascinating people, and I'm really interested to hear more about it. So give us a little bit of background. How did you end up there? What was the background to it? And just carry on from there, really.
Well, I guess it started with the International Remote Viewing Conference, and I was talking to some of the guys there about the possibility of me speaking, and there was some debate over the crossover between remote viewing and out-of-body experiences. There was a kind of resistance, in a way, to sort of put the two in the same kind of category, which was interesting to me.
Where was that? Where was the remote viewing conference?
That was in Las Vegas.
Right.
So I went initially out to California and to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and then I went to Las Vegas and to the conference and spoke there. So it was kind of split between those two places. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of discussion about the crossover, and I think that was maybe the value of speaking at a conference on something like remote viewing, which I have always been focused on as well and interested in, but it's not the main area that I'm known for or focused on. So I guess it was by going out there and having that dialogue, it was very well received. I got a hugely positive response from the audience. by talking about the veridical sides of out-of-body experiences, the data that comes through in remote viewing, and then looking at actually at how we perceive and how I think the visual components of out-of-body experiences might function. There's some interesting crossovers that we can talk about in the way that perception seems to work within the experiences.
So when you mentioned that there was a degree of resistance to the overlap between the out-of-body experience and remote viewing, I'm intrigued by that. Could you just a little bit expand on the discussions and how those discussions went in Las Vegas first? Because it's quite intriguing, because I'd have thought that most people would have thought there were similarities there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people definitely do. In my conversation with Russell Targ, for example, who was one of the fathers really of remote viewing, when I described some of my experiences, he was interested to know why I considered them out-of-body experiences and not remote viewing, for example. And there was this discussion that we had about that, and really, I guess it's the level of immersion within the experience and the sense of being completely located at the other location, rather than the process of being in the room and fully conscious of what you're doing at the same time, which is more how most people approach remote viewing. So it brought up a whole range of interesting points, because I've always felt that remote viewing and out-of-body experiences are more closely aligned, say, than out-of-body experiences and lucid dreaming. Whereas it seems more popular to say that lucid dreaming is connected, but that seems more of a stretch for me, more of a difficult connection. Mainly because my out-of-body experiences happen while I'm fully awake, and also when I've monitored myself with EEG equipment, the types of brain states that I experience are different to what would be experienced during a dreaming state. So things like that, I think, have been things that have swayed me away from the dream model.
Intriguing, isn't it? Because I think your point there is a very, very well made one, the question of the level of immersion. From what I understand of people I have discussed with regards to remote viewing, and people who have been involved in remote viewing very much describe the idea that it is almost like a hypnagogic image, in the sense the images come in a particular way as if you are viewing from outside. Whereas I know from when you and I have had our many discussions on the out-of-body experience, you're physically located in three-dimensional space, surrounded by the phenomenal world of the out-of-body experience. And I think, again, touching upon, the dream states as well. It was an interesting point you made there about the EEG traces on an out-of-body experience rather than dream states. What are the differences then in terms of the way in which the EEG trace looks? In sort of layman's terms, what is the difference?
Well, it seems far more like essentially like normal consciousness in essence. That it depends when you look at mine, there's maybe particular characteristics. When you look at other people, there's different characteristics. I think there's been a lot of people looked at it. For example, Charles Tart, when he was doing his experiments, I remember that he looked at some individuals who were having out-of-body experiences, and their EEG readouts seemed to suggest that they were having something like an experience of three-dimensional space, as you say, but removed from their body. So it was like information from a three-dimensional space was coming into the brain, but not via the senses. That's kind of how the EEG seems from that level. But then when you look at the dream state, obviously there's a very distinctive pattern to dreaming. It's a very well defined and understood state that people get into when they're in dream sleep. So I think that there's things like that. Then for example, there's the research of Ingo Swan that Michael Persinger has done, where he's looked at, for example, Ingo's brain waves and activity when he was accurate in his remote viewings seemed to suggest that he was perceiving something in three-dimensional space. Again, there was parts of his occipital parietal junction were active. But then also there was the suggestion that the brain in general was active. So it was more like how the brain would react if sensory information was coming in. So rather than it being one specific part of the brain that was active, it was the whole of the brain acting as if it was experiencing a scene, going through its normal processes in the world. So it seems to me that maybe with the out-of-body experience, it's more like data coming into the brain from somewhere else, whereas within the dream, it's more like there's a particular state of consciousness that's associated with it. So I think that's kind of where the data suggests that it leads for me. And then when I look at my own EEG readouts, it was a long time ago I did that work, but it seems to support that idea that the brain is functioning very closely to how it would in normal conscious awareness. But obviously then we get into the problem that there are different types of out-of-body experience. There'll be experiences that happen within sleep paralysis that are considered out-of-body experiences. There'll be out-of-body experiences that do sound very much like lucid dreams to me, but then they're described as out-of-body experiences. And then there's the types that I have, which are more from a waking state and things like that. So I think as well, part of this process is we need to move towards new language and to really define and pin down these different types of perceptions and states. So that's kind of my take on it.
Okay. As you're aware, there's been a series of debates on my Facebook wall recently on the idea of what evidence we can present to a materialist reductionist scientific world as to these phenomena, which effectively are, in the final analysis, subjective phenomena, and how one could ever manage to quantify them in using the scientific method, i.e. repeatability, within laboratory conditions, and something that can be traced externally. Now, effectively, what you're saying here, and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this, but the idea is that we have here tangible or at least quantifiable information that can be shown to be the case that when somebody is in altered states of consciousness and when they are experiencing an out-of-body experience, the brain is reacting in a way that suggests it is actually perceiving a three-dimensional reality external to itself. Therefore, the parts of the brain that light up when somebody's having an out-of-the-body experience are quantitatively different, and different areas of the brain light up to when somebody is in a dreaming state. Now, to me, this suggests that this is of great significance, because it's the first point where we're actually saying that, you know, we can present scientific evidence using scientific metrics that will show that there is a difference in these brain states, and it is of importance. And I think that is of great significance, and I think it's something that you and I, I'm sure, in our future plans will pursue in greater detail in terms of this. Okay, now, so moving on. So you were at the conference in Vegas and everything else, and there were bridges built between the remote viewing team, or the people who are interested in remote viewing, and the people like yourself who are interested in the out-of-body experience. So what then happened to actually facilitate the visit to California?
The California side of things was more that as I was going out to the US, I wanted to connect with some people that I know and I've worked with in the past over there, and I also wanted to visit ION. So my plan was really to just start the trip in California and visit the Institute of Noetic Sciences, give a talk there. So I spoke with some of the organisers there, and then gave a talk mainly to the scientists and a few students about my work and my perspectives on the whole thing.
Can I just stop you there? Graham, can I just stop you there just to make sure that we can put this in context? There will be listeners and reviewers out there who won't know what IONS is. Can you just explain a little bit what IONS stands for and the background to IONS, where they are and what their philosophy is? Because I think it's important for the listeners out there to realise that there is a scientific institution in Petaluma, I think, in California, who are very much interested in the kind of stuff we are talking about and doing the science of it. So if you can just put that a little bit in context as well.
Well, yeah, the ION stands for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and there's a group of scientists over there and researchers who are devoted to looking at these noetic areas, the areas that are like the faculties of human beings that seem to be beyond the normal senses, beyond the normal understanding of what it is to perceive things. So I think that's really their area. And the team's headed up by Dean Radin, who's probably the top person worldwide in terms of looking at these kinds of areas. And he's done research into presentiment, feeling the future. He's done work with remote viewing in the past. He's currently doing work with affecting the quantum double slit experiment in a psychic sense, which was the experiment I took part in while I was over there. So he's looking at a whole range of different areas, and they've also got online experiments, etc. So people all over the world can actually take part in some of the experiments. So for me, as part of my own journey to understand these things more, it was the next step in a way. I've worked with Rupert Sheldrake in the past and organised experiments for him and also taken part in experiments with him. So I wanted to then work with some of the people over in California and get an idea more of what they're doing. So that was really the next step for me. So that was one of the reasons I went over there.
Okay, because one of the things as well that the viewers need to be aware of as well is that the most famous person involved in ions in terms of probably world reputation is Edgar Mitchell, who was one of the guys who actually walked on the moon. Now, this is, again, fascinating in the sense that somebody such as Edgar Mitchell, who would be what would be considered to be a top scientist, research scientist, and also one of the first few human beings that's actually looked at the Earth from the surface of another planet. And I know that Edgar had a certain experience, for want of a better term, while he was on his way back to Earth, which made him question in great detail the materialist world viewpoint, to say that there is more than materialist reductionism in terms of understanding the universe and how consciousness interfaces with this. And again, Dean Radin and all the other individuals, James O'D and other individuals that are involved in ions, you know, these are top scientists. These are not just a group of new age wackos, for want of a better term, that have got together and are playing around with it. They really are genuinely doing the science. And I think it's organisations that ions that compromise in many ways and threaten the scientific viewpoint these days, because the scientific viewpoint is happy to have people considered and compartmentalized as being new age and slightly flaky and slightly weird, whereas these guys are doing the science. They're doing reproducible science. They're actually working in the scientific method, which is the way forward as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so you then made your way over, and how did you actually come about getting the contact with ions and arranging for the first thing is how you arranged to get over there in terms of getting the talk and everything else, and then what your impressions of ions were when you were there, because I've never been there and I'm always fascinated to speak to somebody who's actually physically been on the campus there to find out what it's like, what the dynamics like, and also finally, you know, the audience you had was a mixture of students and scientists, so therefore you had some very interesting people there. So can you tell us a little bit about that background and then a little bit about your talk and how that went down?
Sure. Well, I guess in terms of organising, I've always been quite close to ions in terms of looking at the research they're doing. I've written for their journal in the past, so I wrote an article on out-of-body and near-death experiences for their journal. So basically a contact that I already had. I just sent them an email and said that I was going to be out in the California area, and would they like to have me down at the campus, basically. And then the talk was organised from that point on, really. So then just went down there. The campus is it's quite small. It's not a huge place, but they're close to it's a very laid back, nice atmosphere to the whole environment. And when you go in, you get a sense of the people there are really looking at these things in a very positive and very balanced way. And there's no, I guess sometimes when I've been to sort of more skeptical environments, it can have a certain hostility and a resistance to looking at certain areas, where IONS feels more like a think tank. It's very open-minded, and people are looking into different avenues, and they're very responsive. When I did my lecture, there was a real responsiveness from the people, but from researchers as well, not just from the students. There was some really high-level people. The co-founder of Pixar Studios was in the audience and was asking some pretty interesting questions, and we actually talked about a kind of experiment with the out-of-body experience and things like that. So I think there'll be future areas. I'm kind of interested in seeing what might happen with that, but I think overall they've got a very, very good setup. And then Dean Raid in his lab has a Faraday cage essentially, but it's made into a full room that's completely sealed to electromagnetic signals. So when you go in there, it's a very strange feeling. It's like going into a room with absolutely no sound or something like that. You get a slight strange feeling in your chest almost, because there's just no fields that you're used to when you're kind of walking around in everyday life. So you go into this room.
Can you explain again to the viewers what exactly a Faraday cage is, and why it is important that Dean Radin and his co-experimenters have that kind of environment within their research facility? What is it that is important about blocking out electromagnetic radiation? So if you just give a little bit of background to that.
Okay, well, yeah, the Faraday cage is basically a system for blocking out the electromagnetic frequencies. The reason I'm not sure what Dean would say, but I think the main reason is so that no signals or anything could interfere with the experiments. And there was a time when electromagnetism was thought to be one of the possible carriers for psi abilities, but that's since been discounted. So I think in some of the experiments they started to use a Faraday cage as a way of eliminating that as a possibility, and then that started to be used as a way to also avoid anything like mobile phones or anything like that interfering with the process. And especially when in this particular experiment they're working with a quantum effect, it's essentially the double slit experiment. Because of that, I'm sure that any kind of influence coming into the space would be unwanted. So really they want to control that environment as much as possible. And I think that's something that Rupert Sheldrake was quite focused on as well, because when the experiments I did with him a few years ago were taking place, we used a similar environment where there was no signals, and it was in an underground space. And the reason for that was to try and limit any possibility of any signals and things like that. So I think that's really the reason. But I don't know whether it was something to do with this strange feeling inside that unit, but it seemed to have quite a powerful effect on me and started to induce the vibrational state, the early stages of the out-of-body experience, or it had that effect on me anyway, that I started to go into that kind of state, which was very interesting. And then there was a strange heat anomaly that took place as well, witnessed by the other people in the space. So I started to feel this intense energy while I was trying to affect this double slit experiment psychically. And every time I sort of put my focus and concentration onto it, I started to get the sensations as if I was going into an out-of-body experience. But then on the recording that goes with this experiment, the recording tells you when to focus and when not to focus. So there would be a part in the recording where it would tell me to relax and not to focus. So I would kind of bring myself back out of that energy that I was feeling. But then when the experiment was over and the door was open, everyone in the room next to the unit felt this kind of rush of heat that came out of the environment. But the interesting factor was that the Faraday unit is monitored for temperature, and when the researcher checked the temperature before and after, there was no difference in the temperature. So there was no temperature change reading during the experiment, even though the people in the room felt this intense heat. The researcher's words were, it's like a sauna. So it was a very tangible heat.
It's intriguing, that, isn't it? Because one of the things many, many years ago, when I was involved in my own little playing around with research into anomalous circumstances, one of the things that we were very interested in was there was a pub in Warwickshire that had a cold spot. There had been a murder that had taken place there many years before. And in one of the bedrooms of this particular pub, there was a cold spot. And it was interesting that we actually heard, now again, this is an interesting thing, that you could feel the cold, but it would never register on a thermometer. Now, of course, this leads to the questions of when we sense these things. Again, we're coming back to something I know and you and I have discussed many, many times, is the concept of qualia. And of course, the idea of the intensity of a feeling of heat or a feeling of cold. Of course, the feeling of heat or the feeling of cold don't actually exist out there in the world. You know, effectively, it is the way our nerves convey temperature changes in such a way to give us a sensation when we realize it's getting hot and getting cold, but it's brain generated. So here we have a classic example of a very, very peculiar phenomenon. Now, one of the things that I'm really quite fascinated now by, and I'm jumping around a little bit, and it is because I haven't had the chance to ask you these questions before, but this experiment you were doing with the twin slit experiment sounds very, very intriguing. If you could explain, I know you and I are both aware, and probably many of the listeners out there are aware of the twin slit experiment and exactly how anomalous it is, but if you can explain a little bit about the twin slit experiment in very, very short amount of time, because I know, having tried to write a description of the twin slit experiment and why it's so strange, you end up writing chapters on the subject. But effectively, more importantly, what was the experiment about, and what were they trying to do, and what were the results of it?
Well, essentially, the experiment is looking at this quantum effect, this double slit effect, which essentially there's a laser. There's an interferometer in the room, which is essentially sends photons, particles of light, through the slits. There's a small metal panel. Dean showed it to me. You can actually see the slits quite clearly. They're not microscopic or anything. They're quite visible to the eye. And these photons are fired through these slits. And the general principle that I'm sure many people will have heard of is when the device is not being measured, it will create a pattern, a particular pattern across the sensitive panel at the back. And when it is being measured, it collapses the function, and you get the photons start to make a different pattern, a more consistent divided pattern on the back of the panel. So within this particular experiment, the idea is essentially that Dean was wondering what would happen if you psychically put your attention into that process. So instead of the observer being a literal physical person going in and taking that measurement, what would take place if the observer essentially was a psychic perception? So what would happen if you tried to affect that experiment in some form? So the system, as far as I know, Dean didn't go into all of the technicalities with me, so I can't be 100% sure. So I'm giving you a general overview of what I think the process is. But the idea is to create a deviation away from the standard functioning of the interferometer. So if they know that it's doing this in the control periods, what then happens when someone like me is in there trying to affect the waveform or the pattern that the device is making. So that's essentially what you're trying to do. And even within the experiments, there are the quiet points. So there's the point where they tell you to concentrate, so you'll put your attention onto the device, and then there's a point when they tell you not to concentrate. So that then is used as control material as well. So they have control data from when there's no one in the unit at all. It's just a sealed unit, and they get the particular wave formation. Then they have someone in there, and then they compare the data from that, and then they also have the other instance where you're actually not focusing, so they can compare that as well. So there's the three different streams of data. So far, when I was at IONS, there'd only been 11 people through the system, so they haven't got enough data for statistical significance yet. But what was clear, what was interesting, was of the 11 people who'd been in there, all of them had positive results in the predicted direction, i.e. they had all shown some kind of effect that seemed to support the idea that a psychic observation affected the collapse of the wave function. So it was a quite interesting experiment to be involved with. I don't know when it will be complete, but it's definitely seems to be showing that there's a real effect again in that area.
It's very intriguing, this, isn't it? Because it was the twin slit experiment, I think, of when I first encountered it many, many years ago, that started my interest in the implications of consciousness and physical reality. Because effectively, the issue is the existence of waves and particles, isn't it? And the idea that if somebody is not observing a subatomic particle, it is a statistical wave, which effectively means that it could be located anywhere. And it's as a wave is something that waves in something else. So effectively, if you take two slits and you place it in water, the wave, and then you make waves in the water. As the waves approach the two slits, there will be a single wave. And as the waves go through the two slits, you will then get two wave patterns the other side, which will then show themselves on a sensitive device as actually being effectively sort of bands of light and dark, or levels of intensity where the interference, where the waves interfere with each other in one way or another. Because if two waves come together, you get a high wave, and if they actually interfere in another way, they actually stop the wave moving altogether. And what they've found is, as Graham was trying to say there, is that if the waves are not observed or measured, they continue to be waves, but if they are observed, they actually change from being a wave, a statistical wave, into a point particle, which is effectively the collapse of the wave function. And again, just to stress here, this is not a hypothetical theory. This is something that happens every time they do this experiment. So it's not like it's something that they've noticed that's kind of odd. It's something that happens all the time. And the question is the act of observation the thing that actually collapses the wave function into a point particle or not? But what Dean Radin's doing here, as I understand it, is to doing something even more interesting, where he's actually saying, if the observer is a psychic, whatever we mean by psychic, does that affect the wave function in another way? So this is very intriguing and very exciting work. Now, if anybody's interested in the work of Dean Radin as well, there is another interview by an associate of mine who interviewed Dean Radin recently, and I will put this link up on my Facebook wall in due course, because you might find this quite interesting as well. But going back then to your conversations with Dean Radin, I mean, it must have been a wonderful opportunity to talk to one of my all-time intellectual heroes as to the work he's doing, because you touched upon his work on presentiment, which I think he did with Dick Bierman, and it would be interesting to just touch upon what you discussed with him, because it would be fascinating to just have a chat with the guy. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, we talked about out-of-body experiences, I guess, primarily during the lecture, and then over lunch we were talking about things like the technology and the possibilities of enhancing these abilities, because I was interested what his thoughts were on the use of things like sensory deprivation. Because it seems to me, if you look at, for example, the data from the Gansevelt experiments, Gansevelt telepathy experiments, where they used mild sensory deprivation on ordinary people just straight off the street, they used this mild sensory deprivation in order to try and get them into a more of an altered state in order to allow for an increase in their psi ability. So it's a way of enhancing it to some degree in an ordinary person. Now, what's always intrigued me is we had that data that shows really that there's an increase in ability when there's a mild form of sensory deprivation. So my wonder in terms of parapsychology is why we haven't pursued that further, why we haven't looked at other areas of immersion and sensory deprivation, because I have worked a lot with that in my own ways of inducing out-of-body experiences, my virtual reality structures, my non-virtual reality structures, and also things like flotation tanks and other forms of sensory deprivation. So it seemed to me that I was interested to know on one level why that hasn't really been pursued, and Dean felt that the main reason was the costs and the practicality of it in terms of replication, which is quite frustrating in one way, because it's we may have a clue to what could enhance all of this, but we're not being able to pursue it because we're still at that point where we're trying to convince people that these things are real, even though, as Dean points out, it's the latest presentiment or precognition research had a significance level of 6 sigma, which is higher than the Higgs boson experiment in terms of significance, but it's still ignored generally. So in a way, if we could get to the point where we could say, all right, it looks like there's something there, maybe we could then move the research forward and start to really get into these areas like enhancing it. I know that Michael Persinger, for example, in Canada is looking at transcranial magnetic stimulation to try and enhance remote viewing and telepathy, for example. So I think those things are really what fascinate me now, how we could sort of try and move the whole thing forward and enhance these abilities to some degree.
I think this is the exciting times that we live, and also the frustrating times we live, because one of the major criticisms of myself, yourself, and those of us that I think that are trying to take a considered scientific, rational viewpoint to these phenomena, we get criticized all the time because they're saying, well, where is your evidence? Where are the academic journals? Where are the reports? Where are your experimental proofs? But of course, the problem is these things cost money. And it was a discussion item on my Facebook wall recently when somebody said, Tony, why don't you start doing experiments to actually prove the ideas that you have and to prove the hypotheses and the speculations you make? But the reality is these things are very, very expensive. And of course, on top of that, whereas when you're dealing with external phenomena in the phenomenal world, effectively you have substances and you can do experiments upon them, and then you can do statistical analysis. But we're dealing here with I suppose, as a social scientist, I would say we're dealing with social science with bells on, because effectively it's not just how people think and feel as it would be in sociology or psychology, but it's things that are unusual. So therefore there are things that people cannot control. You know, it's not as if individuals can spontaneously recognize. It's not that individuals can spontaneously, at a shout, actually get outside of their body and do veridical viewings, because it doesn't work that way, because the whole phenomenon is curious in itself. And I think it's the way we need to go forward. And I'm hoping before we finish the interview, you and I can announce one or two ideas we've got in terms of this going forward. But I'm aware of time, and as is always the case with these interviews, we are aware of time. What I'd like to do now is to move on from your work with Dean Radin to your fascinating discussions with Eben Alexander. And just for a background again, for those people listening in who are not aware of Eben Alexander is a neurologist who was seriously ill, and while he was seriously ill had what can only be described as an amazing near-death experience, which made him completely revise his own position as a materialist reductionist. Actually having experienced the thing itself, completely revised his worldview on it. And I was very excited to see that Graham had actually met with Eben Alexander and had the opportunity to be interviewed with him and indeed interview him. I'm also delighted to know that Eben has actually, in the bibliography of his first book, he actually cites my first book is Their Life After Death, which is fantastic. And again, I really thank him for that. But what I'd like to do is Graham, how did you engineer the meeting with Eben? What was he like? And can you tell us a little bit about what information you got from him in terms of his experiences? Because it would be great to get Eben on this show, but I know he's an extremely busy guy. And the next best thing is you know, sort of to do it through your viewpoint on him and how he came across to you.
Well, he was headlining the remote viewing conference, so and he attended my lecture, so he was aware of what I was doing in that context. And then I was talking to David Wilkinson, who's one of the organizer of the allreality.com website, which basically he's trying to bring together veridical data to do with out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. That's one of his main goals. So he's a really interesting guy in California who's really trying to do that. So he was talking to me about my work and my veridical experiences and things like that. And he's basically going around filming different scientists about quantum physics, about these kinds of psychical research areas, all of that kind of stuff, basically. And so he wanted to film the two of us together having a dialogue. So basically asked Eben if he'd be interested. Eben was interested, so we basically just sat down and had a dialogue. And Eben, basically, I think the most important thing, I mean, Eben's experience didn't have anything veridical as such in the experience, but I think what he was able to do was, through the appearance of certain faces towards the end of his experience, he was able to suggest that the timing of the experience was when he was at the deepest level within his coma. So I think what he feels that his experience shows is that while his brain was deeply in pus, essentially, he was suffering from bacterial meningitis. So the neocortex of his brain, which is usually associated with consciousness and that kind of function, was essentially shut down. So I think his main argument is that all of this rich experience, the richest experience he's ever encountered, all took place at a time when, according to conventional neuroscience, he shouldn't have been able to have any function whatsoever. So I think that's what he feels.
Graham, as a quick question there, how did he know, if he was already in a deep coma state when he was perceiving these things, how does he know that it wasn't? How did he know that was the experience happened at the external timing that he believed it did? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, But could it not be that he was actually having the experience as he was coming to from the coma, and therefore believed that the dream had or the near-death experience had taken place while he was in the deepest coma state, was in fact it was a part of the waking and coming to?
I put that question to him as well, and it's also been put to him in the debate I took part in with him on a radio show, and it seems I don't want to quote him exactly because I think he would need to answer that to be precise, but as far as I understand it, there were faces present in a particular part of the experience that were only present at one point during his coma. So he feels that he was essentially perceiving people around him at a point when he was deep in coma and his neocortex wasn't functioning. So and also because of that, he believes that he can time basically when some of the key elements of the near-death experience was taking place. So while these things are always limited to some degree, I think that what he's saying, is definitely quite strong in the sense of how could he have had such a rich experience during a time when his neocortex wasn't functioning. And I guess actually even the new information from the AWARE study, although it was generally quite a disappointing study, the one case that they did report that was quite fascinating was the case of the near-death experience that they were able to time because of there was a machine in the operating theatre that would make a noise precisely every 3 minutes. And the man, during his near-death experience, heard this noise twice. So because of that, they know that he must have been out of body for a minimum of 3 minutes, and it must have taken place during his cardiac arrest, essentially. So because of that, they're able to precisely time when the experience would have taken place. So although the study in general didn't bring the results that many people hoped, I think that case does suggest, as Sam Parnier has pointed out, does suggest that there's some kind of awareness when the brain is not functioning in any normal way that we understand.
I know that when I discussed this, I was at the Society for Psychical Research at the library, probably this time last year, doing research from one of my books. And I discussed the Pam Reynolds case. And one of the things I mentioned there was that there seems to be, I think there was a guy called Augustino that wrote an article for the International Association of Near-Death Studies academic magazine. And one of the things he argued was that the Pam Reynolds case and many, many cases of near-death experiences and supposed mental activity at the lowest point where somebody shouldn't be conscious, shouldn't even be aware, there should be no brain activity whatsoever, is because they're actually waking up and they're coming out of the coma. And the guy I was talking to is a research scientist. Unfortunately, his name escapes me at the moment. And he said, no, that doesn't work that way, because effectively the way in which the brain is scrambled as somebody is coming out of these coma situations, there is no brain activity properly that we would call it. And even if it was, the way in which the neurological constructs of the brain in these kind of brain states, when you're coming out of deep coma or when you're coming out of a general anesthetic, you can't construct dreams, because dreams don't take place because of the way in which the brain is confused. So they say the argument to say that it is something that is taking place as you come out of the coma isn't really a valid argument. And I thought that was really quite a fair argument to put forward. Also, with regards to the AWARE study, I'm totally in agreement with you on this, that in many ways it was somewhat disappointing. And I remember actually, I mean, you and I worked quite closely on a lot of these things, but when I was doing the research for my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I held back the publication of that book, awaiting the results of the AWARE study, hoping that we would get something really powerful out of it. And it has been somewhat disappointing. And it concerns me slightly that if you read reports that are cited on Facebook and in other reports in sort of what I would call believing groups, they're putting forward and saying that, the Aware study is categoric proof of consciousness after death. And of course, it's nothing of the sort. What it is evidence that there can be brain activity when the brain is inactive. But this is not the same as actually saying that the near-death experience is anything greater than that. So it's not proof, but it is an intriguing study, and I congratulate the people, Sam Ponnier and his associates, for being brave enough to do such a thing, and I'm hoping at some time in the future to speak to Peter Fenwick on this subject, because he's one of the research scientists that actually work with the charity I'm working with at the moment. So I'm hopeful to maybe speak to him about this at some time in the future. So in terms of his experiences generally, did you feel that he had, a complete worldview change after his experiences? I mean, a lot of people are criticising him, saying, oh, he's doing it for the money. But from what I've seen of him, he doesn't need to do it for the money. He seems to be somebody who's had a genuine experience that's really shaken his worldview. I mean, what's your opinions on that?
Well, I think if he was just doing it for the money, he's already sold over 2 million books in his first book, and I don't know. I wouldn't have thought he would be that focused on making more money after already having done that, and he was already quite a successful surgeon on top of it. So it seems an odd career angle to take if you're just doing it for the money. So I don't know, but those kinds of things are, they're things that people can throw out there, but that they don't require any evidence to back up such a statement. It's just, that's why he's doing it. So I doubt very much that that's his motivation. But I think, yes, he's had a complete worldview change, because he now thinks that the brain is essentially a filter for consciousness. So he's come to that particular viewpoint, and doesn't feel that consciousness is dependent in any way on the brain. So he's gone almost to the other end of the continuum, if you like, in terms of ideas about what could be going on in terms of consciousness. So yeah, I think he's had a complete worldview change. He says that he meditates for long periods each day. He's very focused on using different sound technologies and things like that as well to re-access those kinds of states. So it seems like it's opened up a whole new area for him in terms of how he perceives things. So yeah, definitely changed his life, I think.
Okay, right. We're down to the last 5 minutes now of the show. What I'd like to do now is to discuss, or for you and I to just discuss, the things that we are planning to do or hoping to try and do in the future, in terms of some kind of event in London, if we can get it off the ground. Would you explain a little bit about it? Because I'd rather not talk about it, because it's me interviewing you. So tell us a little bit about the things we're thinking of trying to do, because I'm very, very excited about this, Graham. I think it could be a very interesting exercise.
Well, we're thinking of essentially a workshop that brings together the practical and more practice-based side of the out-of-body experience and consciousness in general, through my work and my work with technology, my work with remote viewing, my work with out-of-body experiences, and all of this kind of research that I've done and put into my books over the last getting near to 30 years now, compared to your research that's focused more on the science and the theoretical models and your own particular idea about how consciousness might function and work, etc. So I think the idea is to create an event that would bring those two things together, which I think would be very, very unique, really, because we both have a similar ethos and worldview because of our scientific angle on things, but we have complementary areas of expertise. So I think the two would come together very well and would give people coming to an event like that a lot to work with and take away from the event. So that's really something that, yeah, we're both very excited about, I think.
Yeah, we certainly are. We're hoping to try and get a venue probably in central London, but we're at very, very early stages on this, and we really need to flesh out the ideas of how we're going to do it. But I think that an awful lot of individuals, or many individuals, be quite interested in being involved in this, because it is, again, the first step on what Graham and I think is a longer term plan. We're trying to do something positive and scientific with these subjects, and you know, Graham and I have met on quite a few occasions and discussed in great detail the importance of this. Okay, well, I'm aware that we're starting to run out of time, so again, it's always the case, Graham, that we only ever scratch the surface here. Again, you know, you will be back as a future guest of that, I'm absolutely sure. And my thanks again to Graham for this, and keep your eye out for the event when we get it off the ground. Just to let you know that my next guest will be, and I need to check this because we've been booking a lot of people in recently, will be writer Jason Gregory, who will be joining me from the USA. Thanks again for everybody for joining us. My best wishes to 2014 to you all, 2015 even, to you all. And again, my thanks to our genius in the background, Dia Nunez over there in Denver, Colorado, because without Dia's work and without Dia's focus in making this happen, this show just wouldn't occur. And I mean, she very rarely butts in here and makes comments on here, but believe me, without her involvement, we could not do it. So thanks again for joining us, and look forward to meeting you all again next month with our next edition of the Consciousness Hour show. Thank you very much, and my thanks again to Graham from very, very snowy Baltic states up there. Thank you.